All right, class, we are ready to get started with chapter one. What I have for you is a hopefully 15 to 20 minute little PowerPoint, which will kind of go over some of the basics of what psychology is, where it comes from, and some of the famous people who have been psychologists. Some people I know you've heard of, some people probably not. But we're going to hit all of them today. Hopefully this won't last too awful long, but we're going to get going. As you can see on the PowerPoint in front of you, psychology comes from two root words, the Latin psyche, meaning the soul, and ology, which means the study of course, biology, meaning life, the study of life. We're not really going to look at the soul per se. This was something that, again, Latin terms could be here or there. But generally, when we're talking about psychology, it's, people think of the soul being on the inside. Well, that's kind of what we're going to look at is what happens on the inside to show what happens, to show or to do, that causes us to do things on the outside. So, what is psychology? Again, the study of behavior and mental processes. So there's two parts to it. And something to make sure that you all are aware of is that is a science. So as such, we use the scientific method, which I know you've gone over since you were in elementary school, but it is important to know that we do use the scientific method. And it is considered a science. It also, make sure we know what we're all on the same page. When we're talking behavior, we're talking about things that we can actually see people do, which is different from the mental processes, which are all things we really can't see. My daughter is in the room right now, and it's a lot of times we never quite know what's going on in her head in the mental processes, but sometimes her behavior sheds light on that. So she may scowl when she's upset with her brother or things like that. But there is a difference between the behavior, which is something we can observe, and the actual mental processes on what's going on inside her head. That also includes, things like memories, recalling memories, using information, dealing with feelings, stuff like that. What psychology is not. Okay, I will not be reading your mind. You will not be reading other people's mind. You are not going to learn how to control other people's minds. And then, of course, I am not a therapist. I am not a psychologist, nor am I a psychiatrist. So I am not the one to diagnose, or I am not the one to treat any psychological disorders of any kind. I don't have that kind of training, and really you won't either, even at the end of this course. Now, hopefully this course will lead you into something a little further on when you're in college. You may find this interesting enough to major in it, in which case you'll make a whole lot more money than me. There are, as I had mentioned in my intro video, there are psychological disorders. Around 450 million people worldwide suffer from some sort of psychological disorder. Most people will say that they either know somebody or they themselves have been some sort of association with psychological disorders. I know for myself, my brother suffers from schizophrenia. And so we'll talk about him. I'll use him quite a bit in some of our lectures, especially when we get to, the actual chapter on psychological disorders. But in the prevalence of psychopathology in America, mental illness is a lot more common than most people realize. Around 15% of our population suffers from some sort of diagnosable mental health problems. There are some that have yet to be diagnosed. Other studies find that during any given year, the behaviors of over 65 million Americans meet the criteria for a diagnosable psychological disorder. Now, whether they're actually diagnosed is something else. And over a lifespan, as many as 32% of Americans suffer from some sort of psychological disorder. Now, that is not to say that they suffer from it their entire life. I don't know if any of you have known anybody who suffer from depression, but a lot of times depression will come in bouts. If you look at somebody's life as like a timeline, there may be a small snippet like right here where somebody suffers from depression, anxiety, or something like that, and the rest of it's fine. All right, but that would fall into that 32%, somebody who's actually suffered from it. Now, again, you may never know it. 32% is basically 1 out of 3 people. So if you look around in your household, 1 out of 3 of them, according to this statistic, has suffered some sort of psychological disorder. And then when you come to class, look at your classroom, a third of those people as well. So just something to keep in mind. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of psychology and where it got its start. And I don't know if we'll get to perspectives in this video. I haven't decided yet how I want to do that. But I do want to talk about a little bit about the history. Generally, this is just so you know, this is 2 to 4% of the AP exam. So there will be questions about history and approaches on your AP exam when you take it on May 7th. I think it's the 7th. Psychology is a science. It's fairly new, but it is also has really changed a lot. Its beginning is around 1879. As you might guess, just like in technology, there's been huge changes from when it started to especially where it is today, especially when you're talking about the diversity of approaches and especially the ability to gather data. Now that we've got some technology advances, things like MRIs, to be able to really look inside the brain and to see what's going on as we sleep or as we experience pain or happiness, things like that. Here are your, I can statements. These are things you should be able to do. Should be able to recognize how philosophical and psychological perspectives shape the development of psychological thought. Should be able to describe and compare different theoretical approaches in explaining behavior. And these are some of the things here that you're going to have to be able to at least recognize and talk about. Structuralism, functionalism, and behaviorism. These are sort of the early things, the early approaches. A little later comes Gestalt, psychology, and psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. This is Freud's big thing right here. And then humanism kind of comes in a little later. And then included is evolutionary psychology, biological psychology, cognitive psychology, and psychosocial. And these are all fairly contemporary, newer approaches. You need to be able to recognize strengths and limitations of the different theories as they explain behavior. Should be given you should be able to take a scenario or a behavior and discuss how each one of these approaches will explain the behavior. And we'll have some practice with that a little later. So, origins, Greeks, if you had me, well, none of y'all would have had me, but I taught 7th grade social studies for 5 years. And one of the things that my students were always, surprised about is how much we got from the ancient Greeks. And psychology is sort of another one. They wouldn't have called it that, but they sort of were the first ones to sort of be thinking along the lines of psychological thought. Um, Descartes, around the Renaissance, really sort of pushed the thoughts of what the Greeks had even further. The whole idea of reason. Um, I believe it was Descartes that came up with the cogito, or what's known as in philosophy is the cogito. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And in class, we'll kind of talk about how he arrived at that. Basically, he's trying to figure out whether he actually existed or if an evil genius was tricking him. Very similar if you've seen the movie The Matrix. He was kind of dealing with that. And we've all, I think, at some point had those thoughts where is reality really as I perceive it to be? And if it's not, then what is reality? So we're going to have some discussions on that. But the cogito is here down at the bottom. I think, therefore, ergo, I am. Or put a little easier, because we think, we exist. John Locke was really influential when it comes to science. We're not going to get into him a whole lot. But this is where we're going to start, was Wilhelm Wundt, or Wundt. It's German, so I believe it's Wundt. But he was really the first person to establish the modern psychological thought, or as modern as you can probably get. He is considered the first psychologist, so he is somebody you need to know. Wilhelm Wundt. He opened the first psychology lab in 1879 at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And what he did in his lab was to measure reaction time to different stimuli. But Wilhelm Wundt, somebody very important. And then one of his students, I don't think he was a student actually. He was a student. Yeah, he was a student. Is E.B. Titchener, and he brought Wundt's psychology to the U.S. And he was really sort of started the school of structuralism, or at least that line of thinking of what we now call structuralism. And that is the study of basic elements that make up the human mental experiences. It looks at the structure of experience and how those things, kind of like a bridge or a building, you've got different structures that kind of come together to make this thing. It's kind of the same idea. He does a lot of introspection, which means to look inward, analyzing immediate sensations and how they relate to one another. I'm hammering something and I hit my nail or hit my finger. All right, so an introspector or structuralist will look at or try and study all the sensations that go along with hitting your thumb with a hammer. Okay, think about the pain, think about the throbbing. So you've got that part of it, but then you've also got the mental part. There's a lot of things that go along with feeling pain. Think about the emotional part. When I have done this before, I have gotten angry immediately. So there's a lot of things that sort of go along with smashing your thumb with a hammer. And the structuralists use introspection, that analyzing those immediate sensations, to sort of study that and to try and figure out really how things are working. The issues with that, though, is that the results were kind of varied. They were unreliable. For example, go ahead and take your nose and put it 5 inches from the screen. Okay, you go ahead and do that. I'll back up because I know that's probably awkward to be looking in my eyes 5 inches from the screen. All right, stare at the screen. Are you ready? Get real close. And All right. Now think about when I flashed that picture, the thoughts that went through your head. All right. Using structuralism and the idea of introspection, if we were going to analyze this, we would analyze your immediate sensations. You'd ask questions like, did the picture make you smile? Did it make you want to cry? How many of you all freaked out? Because I know there's a lot of people who find clowns unsettling, to say the least. Plus, we had that weird scare with people dressing up as clowns and running through people's yards and being stupid. But the structuralist would look at your immediate response to that, and then the sensations that came from staring at this. All right, sorry. And what's interesting is if we polled everybody in class, or if we were able to actually have a conversation right now, what we'd find is everybody would have different sensations. So, and you can kind of see why the results can be varied and unreliable because each person's experience is going to be different. So, again, here's a little more with what's going on. Structuralism. A biggest weakness is that it is subjective. Remember, psychology is a science, so there's got to be some objective. It's got to be objective, meaning there's got to be clear evidence. And when things are subjective, meaning it deals with, I don't know what the good word is, whatever somebody thinks. So, strengths, again, with it, the first major school of thought is influence experimental psychology. So. Then came functionalism. And a man by the name of William James. This is not the William James or the Bill James, if you've ever seen the movie or read the book Moneyball, the guy who came up with the sabermetrics. His name, I believe, is William James. And that's how I remember this guy, but that's not here nor there. He is considered the father of American psychology. And what he, instead of looking at subjective reactions, like how you react when you see a clown face, William James started looking at how the mind and consciousness worked. It actually went a little deeper than subjectiveness. They studied how animals and people adapt to their environments, and this is really was influenced by Darwin when he came out with his Origin of Species and his theory on evolution or survival of the fittest. You know, in order for a species to survive, according to the theory, it has to adapt and figure out a way around the things that want to kill it. So functionalism sort of comes out of that. Again, William James, the first psychologist in the U.S., he actually taught the first psychology class at Harvard. And he asked questions like, why does the brain think? Why does the nose smell? You know, this is more why questions. He wrote one of the first books on psychology. Took 12 years to write. I'll go ahead and talk about some women in psychology. A couple here. Mary Whiton Calkins. She was kind of at the heart of one of the first psychological scandals at Harvard. And then Mary Floyd Washburn, who was the first female PhD to come out of or to get a PhD. Mary Whiton Calkins, she was actually a student of William James at Harvard. And she did not even get a degree. She was refused a degree because she was a woman. All her classmates a lot of times would walk out if she was in class. So she had a pretty rough go of it, as a lot of women did back then. But she was able to she was the first female president of the American Psychological Association. So maybe she got a little bit of get back. And again, then you've got Mary Floyd Washburn, again, first woman to get a PhD in psychology. Her big thing was that she studied animal behavior, and she became president of the APA in 1921. One other big guy we're going to talk about, at least early on, is Sigmund Freud. He was an Austrian physician, and he really looked at the unconscious mind and how it affected human behavior. You've heard of things like maybe the Oedipus complex or the ego or the id. You've heard terms like Freudian slips. He's had such a large influence on psychological thought that it's probably hard to measure. And that's one of the reasons why in the book that I told you about in the intro, is probably a good read because you really get to see where he's coming from as he's creating his theories that really shaped psychological thought for probably half a century. It's really not until the 50s where we really started to hardcore question some of his thoughts. I think that's what we're going to do for this video. So I'm going to close this one up, and we will do some, make sure you fill out the note-taking form as you watch, and bring this to class tomorrow, and we'll see you in the morning. It's Coach River saying peace.